call the special meeting for the Troy Planning Commission and City Council review of the Troy Comprehensive Plan, October 16th, 2024. Do we have a roll call of Planning Commission, please?
Mr. McGarry.
Here.
Mr. Wolke.
Here.
Mrs. Ehrlich. Mr. Titterington.
Here.
Mr. Westmeyer.
Here.
Mayor Oda. Here. Mr. Emmerich. There is a quorum of the Planning Commission present.
Okay, maybe the first thing we ought to do is do a quick introduction of putting names and faces together. I think we read off the Planning Commission, but I'm Jim McGarry.
Mayor Oda.
Patrick Titterington.
Yeah.
Ed Westmeyer.
Larry Wolke, retired curmudgeon.
You want council too?
Sure.
Lynn Snee, at-large council member.
Todd Sievert, at-large council member.
Susan Westfall, at-large council member.
Bill Roselle, President of Council.
Jeff Schilling, Ward 6 councilperson.
I'm Jeff Whidden from the First Ward.
Christy Marshall, second ward.
Samuel Pierce, City Council, Third Ward.
Bobby Phillips, Fourth Ward, and curmudgeon in training.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For the agenda for tonight, we'll first start out with a presentation by Austin Ottermiller and Matt O'Rourke from Structure Point. Then we'll take, I believe you want to have council questions during the presentation. Once we've discussed that between council and the Planning Commission, we'll follow with a public hearing for the public, limited to maybe 3 minutes, with time for questions and answers following the discussion between council and the Planning Commission. Austin, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Good evening. Not to steal too much of our consultants' thunder for their presentation, but we're really excited to present this project to you. When we kicked this project off last August with our consultant, American Structure Point, we were really excited for it, and we really wanted this to be the community's plan and really a roadmap for the future. So that led us to a significant amount of public engagement that Matt's going to highlight tonight. We will also go over key areas of economic development, attainable housing, transportation, complete streets, and downtown. And then that'll lead us to our implementation plan that ultimately is called the Critical Path Strategies. And then following this project, we're really excited for the zoning codes and subdivision regs that'll follow. So with that, I'll give you our rock star, Matt O'Rourke.
Hey, thank you very much. It's hard to follow that introduction to that level, so I appreciate it. Yeah, I was just thinking about this before the meeting. I'm sorry, is there?
We're going to, no one can see from this side.
Gotcha. Yep, absolutely.
Well, you're just not that true, dude. You can't see a screen.
Well, while we're doing some musical chairs over there, I'd just say we actually were here for our first presentation almost exactly a year ago. And I got everybody out on the floor there, and I had you drawing with markers and trace paper and giving us a really good physical overview of what the community is, where some of the neat places are, some of the problem spots. And it's hard to believe it's been a year, but then again, I can't believe it's already been a year. And I remember saying that night, wow, it's going to be a year process, and it takes a while, but it goes by really fast. And sure enough, here we are. At least I think it's fun for us. We've really enjoyed being here, and that made it go by quick because we've had such a great time. And I've probably been to more holiday events in Troy than I have been where I live at this point, coming to all these meetings and doing the public engagement. So with that, Mr. McGarry mentioned this at the beginning. Here's kind of a brief agenda. We're going to just do a process recap and overview. We're going to talk about the plan and its sections. I won't be hitting every single strategy in detail since there's a lot in the document itself, but really want to focus on the critical path strategies. That's what we consider the implementation plan. And to talk a little bit about the UDC, but by all means, if there's anything you'd like me to kind of go back over in the middle of the presentation or on any slide, feel free to call out a question, mention it to me. We can take this at whatever pace you're comfortable with. That's just fine by me. Don't feel like we have to wait till the end to hold those questions, because then we do a lot of skipping around, and sometimes it's just easier to talk about it in the moment. So with that, Austin mentioned we started in August, and it was before the meeting I mentioned just a minute ago, and that was really we spent a lot of that time doing what we call our existing conditions report. That was a lot of data. That was a lot of research. That was a lot of what is the snapshot of Troy today in terms of demographics, jobs, where are the existing land uses, some of it we talked about that first meeting. On this slide, I just wanted to highlight from a jobs perspective. Saw a lot of jobs in the community in the early 2000s. There was a dip, understandably, right around 2010, and we did it in 10 years. This was right after the '08 recession. And now, here's Troy back. And so we really wanted to understand Troy's history and what it was from a data perspective, because that is a big part of what informs our recommendations that are in the plan. One more highlight, I remember we talked about this a lot because we presented at that first meeting. Talked a lot about commute patterns, where are people coming from that work here in Troy. And we found out a lot of people come from outside the community to work here, and it's a pretty far distance away in some cases, which means we're an employment center. We're a job center. People are coming here, but also Troy residents are going somewhere else to work. And so we wanted to talk through that and see what kind of strategies we could build around that. And those are just two high-level examples of what that data report looked like, but two that I remember were pretty kind of aha moments for us, and I think through the process. So that was a lot of this. We did this in a lot of topics: parks, economic development, social issues. As we started talking to stakeholders, really became a big part of that. And as we went through the process, we kept doing that data research, but it was always peppered and informed by what we heard from the community. And here we have some highlights of some of the events we did. We did an online survey that had 682 responses. I remember saying a year ago that if we broke our record, which was about 590, we would do some sort of video on TikTok dancing. Haven't made good on that promise yet, but I think we'll figure it out. But I think that's very endemic of what we saw through this process. A lot of people came out. A lot of people were at our meetings. A lot of people interacted with us, whether it be Hometown Halloween, Strawberry Fest, the Grand Illumination. We had a lot of engagement through this process. We broke our record by almost 100 survey responses. We were here in August, did an open house, and this is the first time, and I mean this, is the first time I ever had an audience watching me set up, because they were there 45 minutes early. That usually doesn't happen. Usually people start coming in right around the start time, but they were ready to go, and really, really engaged in the process. So I was really happy with that. I think Troy as a community should be very proud of the fact that they turned out for this process. They really did. Just talking about that a little bit, we had that open house, had about 50 attendees there, looked at our materials, looked at our boards, looked at the critical path strategies, gave us a lot of feedback. I think it officially kicked off at 5:30, and people were there right up till 7, till closing time. I mean, continuing to talk, look through the recommendations, and offer us great suggestions. And then I wanted to highlight, since that time, we've had our virtual open house available through our online platform. So far, we've had 82 unique visitors there, in addition to who came to that public in-person open house, where it's the same boards, it's the same materials, but you can go there and look at it, leave us comments, all those things. So once again, we just had a lot of people participate in this process, and really, really pleased with that outcome. So I mentioned the data, I mentioned the public input, and what that does for us when we start drafting the plan. We start culling through all that data. We start saying, all right, what does it all mean? What are the themes? What are the topics that are boiling out of this? What are the things that are most important? And they become the ultimate sections of the plan, and you can see those on the left side of the screen there. On the right is basically our analysis when we crawl through all the online survey materials, what we hear in person, our stakeholder meetings we did with groups of identified community stakeholders. We start to see patterns develop, and so the most you could see at the top, downtown and the riverfront was a very popular item. People really were interested in that one, and people, we found out through this process, and rightly so, they care about downtown, and it's really important to them, and that came out of this process. Attainable housing options came up, parks came up, all these things that came up, and they become our themes, and they are baked into this process. But I want to highlight that to say, we don't have a cookie cutter approach per se. What we have up there is new sections that we wrote for this town based on what we heard. In fact, we don't usually lump growth management, land use, transportation, infrastructure, and economic development into one section. But because of the ties and everything we heard from this community, it made sense to do that. So that's why it's structured that way. All those things were very interwoven, and I'll explain why in a couple slides, but that was something new we did in this plan. So, any questions on the process and kind of what it took to get to the point where we felt like we were prepared to start drafting? Just take a good pause there. All right. With that, one of the first things we do when we present, we work through with the advisory group, then we start drafting is a vision statement. A comprehensive plan is a high-level look at your community, but it's also setting the tone for how we want to develop and what we want to look like 20 years from now. I throw the caveat out there, it doesn't mean you wait 20 years to do your next update. I think life moves a lot faster than it now. We should do it more frequently, but if we do the things that are in this plan, are we going to get to our vision in 20 years? That's kind of the measuring stick for our recommendations. And I won't read this out loud, but over and over and over again we heard downtown's an activity hub. Troy is an activity hub for employment, for social activities, for restaurants, for being this great center point, not only just for the residents of Troy, but really the whole county. And that's a lot of what's baked into this plan. It's proactive. I've said this many times through the process. It was somewhat hard for us to write recommendations from the standpoint of Troy has done so many things so well and implemented so many things. We really had to kind of think through, all right, what is that next level of recommendations? What's the next thing that Troy would want to take on? And it means they're tougher things to accomplish, but that's good because you're doing such a good job serving all the basic needs and even a step above that, now we can start thinking about the next step on those things. And that's really what this vision statement represents. After that, we develop goals. It's important to note, these aren't meant to like be in order. We're not achieving these. These are themes and high-level goals that kind of are woven throughout the plan document. It's really meant to be, each one of these could apply to every plan section, so we just like to have them there as sort of it's almost like our guiding path. It's our themes that tie all the sections together. And so I won't read each one of these either. There's a lot of words on the screen, but they're all about preserving the city scale, encouraging residential development, everything we heard, ensuring that the parks are right-sized, making sure that we're thinking about these with everything we write and everything we put in this plan. With that, I think one of the most crucial and critical pieces that can come out of a future land use, a comprehensive plan is the future land use map. It's what informs the zoning code that we're going to talk about in a little bit. It really sets the tone for where we think certain types of uses, or as we call them, character classes. And it's important to note, all those colors you see on that map there, those are where, working with staff and our advisory group, we feel the right place for those to develop, but this is full build out in 20 years. There's a lot of growth projected on there, and that's on purpose. We want to make sure that if any of those properties come in for annexation, a development approval, anything along those lines, you're ready for it. You knew exactly what land use was going to be there. We looked at a few options that maybe were less, and we always have multiple scenarios, had less development, and thinking through it with staff really felt like, well, we need to be prepared just in case. And that is a reflection of this map to the tune of, if you look at the light purple color, that's what we call light industrial. A lot of the uses going up along I-75 are in that character class. It's approximately 2,500 acres worth of that. And so you think of 1 million square foot building gets developed on 40 acres approximately. So it's a lot of that. A lot of room for growth there to make sure Troy stays an employment center. You also see a lot of yellow on that map. That's the different forms of residential development, making sure that they're in the right place and that they make sense for the existing networks, the street patterns, all those things. But it's really, really important that we set the stage there. Won't go through all 14 of those, but did want to highlight this one. Single unit detached residential is what more commonly referred to as single family. We don't only just put a color on a map. We craft a narrative around each character class, which in this case is what should single family homes look like, some direction on setbacks. It's important on this slide, and I always like to do this, is say this is not zoning. These are not laws. These are recommendations, things that we'll consider as we're writing the UDC, but very much a tone setter, and I want to make sure it's kind of perceived that way. This is what we are aspiring to with these districts. It doesn't mean we have every little bit and piece figured out for every zoning district just yet. We're working on that, though, I promise. With that, something else that was new and a first time in this plan, we talked a lot about this with the advisory group and staff, is I think one of the big themes that we heard, it was consistent through every sub-theme, is that the residents of Troy understand growth is here, they understand it's going to come, they even understand the benefits of it, whether it be through jobs or new housing, but everybody was very concerned that it happened at the right scale and at the right pace. It was probably mentioned in just about every open-ended comment we had on the public survey. It just kept coming up again and again. So we developed what we call this concept called the close-knit factor. And that is essentially, and you can see it here on the character class example, this one has it too. It's basically certain redevelopments or developments might help lend themselves to what Troy being continued as that close-knit community that it always has been, where people come to downtown and they can do all the things they want to do, and they feel like they know their neighbors and they know everybody's name, to a low, and score is not the right word, it's kind of just more of a consideration or a weight, to where these types of developments may impact that negatively. So what we did was come up with a series of potential, and I say potential because this is going to be codified in the new zoning ordinance standards. We're still working through that, but the idea here is if, let's say, you're a 2 or a 1 on that scale, we want you to consider what your impact to the community is beyond just your development. We want you to think about creating ties to the broader community, in doing that with what we're calling offsets. This is not a comprehensive list of those offsets, but what you see is a table we're working through where, let's say you're single dwelling detached development, single family homes, and you have that close-in factor of a 2. We're going to want you to pick maybe 2 or 3 things from this list to help offset that. That could be an integrated bike trail system, not just along like the frontage of the development, throughout it, connecting it to other places. It could be dedicating new park space that HOA would want to maintain. Or we're even thinking through some higher, more kind of robust offsets that might impact the community in a good way, even more like constructing a 3-mile section of a trail or something off-site. Where we're thinking about that is that maybe you're an industrial development where you want some connectivity, but it doesn't quite make sense to do it all through an industrial park. You could do this offset, essentially. So it's one way to help provide that connectivity. The idea being here is we want development community, we want staff to have something to refer to and say, hey, we want your development. It's important to have jobs, but we also want to make sure it's not just about you. Troy's considered too. And so this was a new concept. It took a while for us to kind of get our heads around it, and I think we still are in terms of the zoning code stuff, but really felt that this is important because of, go back to this slide, what you see there in the percentages from the online survey and our public outreach events as we accumulated the results. It's very much grow a little, very much grow moderately, very much please make sure Troy stay Troy. And that's what's reflected in this concept. So that's kind of it on the land use chapter. The land use chapter is very much about setting the tone for future development, what it should look like, and the close-knit factor. Economic development was another topic that was very heavily talked about. Troy is an economic development center. It's a job center. We got the feeling that that's appreciated and welcome here in Troy, so we want to make sure we thought through that as well. So what I just want to do is highlight in a couple plan sections, and I won't go through each one by one, but every plan section we have in there has 2 sections that it starts out with besides some intro, which is what we learned. I mentioned the existing conditions report and the data analysis. This is a summary of what we learned that's relevant to that particular plan section, and you'll always see that repeated, so you know our recommendations aren't just coming out of our thoughts and our process and what we talked about with the advisory group. It's coming from what we learned in that data report, but also there's a what we heard summary as well, which is here's what the community told us through all the public engagement efforts that we performed. So those 2 pieces are kind of the foundation of each recommendation and each plan section, and that's how we build it up. On this one in particular, just showing that we want to see what we heard about what are Troy's top assets, and local businesses, jobs, location of I-75, that came up a lot. People understanding that those are great assets that we want to hone in on. Sometimes we do go a step further in the plans and do a little more data analysis when it's warranted. Here, as we were looking at what kinds of job growth we like to have, we did something called a shift share analysis, which is a mathematical way of saying, if we look at all those industry categories on the left column there in the table, which ones is Troy doing a really good job at attracting or currently here? When you see a big positive number, especially the column to focus on is called competitive share. That means you're doing something better and you're growing at a faster rate than that industry is across the country. So if we look at fabricated metal product manufacturing with 803, that means we're doing something here in Troy that's really attracting those, and that could be the foundation of an industry cluster. And so when we think about growth sites and all that purple on that map, what we're getting at is let's make sure that we're going after the businesses that make sense here, that have a lot of reason to be here, and we can start thinking about their suppliers, other people, other folks that feed into what we call an industry cluster, which is, it's not just about that one business. It's how do we go out and talk about businesses, like businesses, all those things. Because once you have that set up, they like to feed off each other, and that makes a lot of sense to them, so it just makes you more marketable, so we really wanted to dig into that. We talked a lot about shopping and retail. A lot of our recommendations along those lines are, we want retail, we want it to be robust, we want a lot of other things, but we do need to consider national trends and what's going on. On this particular slide, I talked a little bit about sort of the national trends in towards e-commerce, and you can see that graph. Since 2014, that percentage is just going up and up and up. So in the plan itself, we've actually outlined what we call a retail gap analysis, which is a high-level way of saying, all right, let's make sure we're planning for the right amount of growth, but not over-planning it, especially when it comes to bricks and mortar retail. This is still evolving. This is still going to change, so we want to make sure we're hedging our bets a little bit and not going too far, but making sure we have enough room for high-quality growth. The other concept we really like to get across in this, especially as it relates to Troy, is focusing on what we're calling the entertainment district. Yeah, we all go to Amazon. The story, and if I've already told this anecdote here, I apologize, but, you know, I've been touting shop local my whole career. I'm an economic developer, but when I moved into the third story of an apartment complex coming back from Texas, I was much happier to let the Amazon guy deliver the 50-pound bag of dog food to my doorstep than I was doing it, lugging it up. We all do it. But there are uses out there that really kind of hedge against that. It's still bricks and mortar, but it's more entertainment focused. So restaurants for sure. I think people still want to go out. They still want to be in the district. They still want to have a good time. They're going to go out to eat. And so are there other uses that are complementary to that? So we're not just going out having a meal or a beverage, you know, we're doing other things. So we call it adult lingering or loitering. Axe throwing bars were popular for a while. I might have to update this slide after I rewrote it because I'm not sure they're as quite as popular as they were 5 years ago. But trampoline parks are another good example of this. A place to take your kids, they can bounce around. We want to make sure the codes especially reflect this, that the codes are adaptable and they include these uses in the commerce centers where those are often located and help us fill vacancies if they should arise. So that's a big part of that. Each plan section, after we go through additional analysis, what we heard, what we learned, has a series of objectives. Those are the kind of bold statements on top. They're a little bit more specific than the goals I mentioned earlier, but still kind of general, and then we have the specific strategies under each one of those. And in this case, we could just look at the first one. We want to identify those industry clusters I talked about. So do we have homegrown ones? Then how can we support them? How can we market them? How can we help them grow? We want to develop a robust understanding of those industry clusters. I think there's more research we can do there. A lot of that, I know staff does a great job of doing retention visits. It's asking more questions about that. Who are your suppliers? Are they thinking about relocating? Are they from another country? Are we talking foreign direct investment? There's a whole lot of things we can get into there. These strategies take all that data and that information, and that's what we're trying to summarize here, in this case specifically to economic development. Just running through a couple more quick examples of this. Attainable housing. Housing came up a lot. I wanted to mention it tonight because housing is kind of important to every other chapter in the plan. More housing means more workforce. Housing means more workforce availability, helps our businesses out, helps our retailers out. The land uses that are shown on the land use map are certainly impacted by development from those. So we did a pretty deep dive into what is it that we think we need from a housing perspective in terms of owner-occupied and price points. And a lot of that summarized in here. And just to cherry pick a couple of stats, we looked at the census data in 2020 and it said the average home price was around $156,000. We didn't think so, so we actually dug into the actual county parcel data, and now, since that was 2020, now we're in 2024, that's jumped up a decent amount, as you can tell, almost 100,000. So that's definitely changing, and that was for single unit detached homes. But I think that's the kind of research we did to help us figure out, well, if we're looking at some different options here, what does that mean? How many homes do we need? We put all that in here and even identified some price points. That doesn't mean these are the only types of homes needed. These are just, I'm talking about the last two bullet points. Those are really the ones, the price points and ranges we saw the biggest need from. And so a lot of that thinking went back into the, not just policies related to housing, back to the land use map, to the what does the workforce housing need, all those things. What we heard, very similar, we wanted housing to look like Troy. We want to continue to encourage developers to make sure they fit into the community. We need homes for younger residents. We need homes for options. We were starting to hear a lot of from the community what we're seeing in the data, which is always good for us because that lets us know we're on the right path, but definitely heard that in this case. This is just an example of a case study and something we're thinking about is providing some missing middle housing, things that appeal to a wide range of users. The slide on the right, or excuse me, the right part of the slide is showcasing something from our online survey that just shows what types of housing people wanted, and then how can we make that fit with a few different types of units. Micro units is just want to highlight because it's a newer concept. It's really an efficiency where your living space, your kitchen, everything's kind of one big room. They just design them now so they're more interchangeable. They have flexible furniture. Not just your beds fall out of the walls anymore, now your tables do and your chairs and a few other things. But it's a way to create market housing, meaning a developer can provide it without subsidy, but still do it, if it's a smaller unit, it can be more affordable. And so those are some of the things we were trying to think through in this plan to make sure we're really hitting on those points. Again, we had the objectives and strategies as it relates to housing. So we're trying to accommodate all housing types and densities. And that's reflected in refining the zoning standards to make sure micro units, for instance, are in the right place and are permitted. Talking about accessory dwelling units, that's an ongoing conversation as we dig into the code, but definitely want to make sure we're thinking through all the options. And then all of our options, too, for traditional development, you know, the single-family homes that we see developed in the right place and standards for those as well. That's all baked into this. One final one I'll highlight, and I won't do every piece of what we learn, what we want, but did want to highlight that we spent a lot of time with the advisory group thinking about the start of a complete streets and trails network. I think a number of these were identified, and we really wanted to make sure that we hit all the right pieces of the community, make sure that we hit all the right spots, and that it doesn't mean this is a comprehensive, like this is the only place trails and complete streets map go. I want to highlight that. What we really tried to do was narrow down to where should we start. And we spent a lot of time with the advisory group thinking through this. We did a facilitated exercise, of which you see on the right side was we had them go through this exercise a few times to say, all right, here are the ones that we think are most important to start with, and then as that develops and the system moves on, we can start thinking about the next set. But it was really important that we did that. Really wanted to make sure we had multiple modes of transportation through the community. And here I'll just highlight, we try to integrate what those complete street concepts could look like in terms of a cross-section and some examples, just so we're starting to think through creative ways. In particular, east of 75, right-of-way is a little more limited. It's going to you can't just put a trail in some of those spots. We've got to get a little more creative with how to provide safe but, you know, efficient transportation and other modes of travel for folks that isn't maybe a car. I just put this on the screen here because this was the winner of our public engagement exercises. It didn't seem like folks were too uncomfortable with a bike path on the road, sharing the road, but a physical barrier of some kind was highly sought after, just to give you a little more safety. I don't know. Again, we had the transportation objectives and strategies, and one thing you'd be picking up on now, every plan section has a number of strategies. What we're going to be talking about in a minute is the critical path strategies. They all come from these strategies in each section, but we try to pick out the 15 that are most important. And so, like I was just describing, we take all those strategies, we have them all in the plan, and they're all things we want to implement. They're all great ideas, but where do we start? What's that next step? That's what we call critical path strategies, which is really our implementation section. We didn't arrive at these alone and just, you know, kind of throw darts at the plan and pick them off the wall. We actually went through, I know most of the people in this room were there that evening, I believe, where we went through an exercise that we picked like the top 35 that we thought were the most important and had everybody vote on what they thought were the most important. I do want to point out they're not listed in order of the votes on this particular slide. This is how they're listed in the plan, and that's more in terms of timeline. So at the top of that table is when we think those ones would be done more near term, 0 to 2 years perhaps, and then the other ones are more like a 5-year. And so that was done based on ability to accomplish those in a certain amount of time, but that's how it shook out. These were actually 13 strategies that we really, out of this process, boiled to the top and said, yeah, this is what we want to do in the next 5 years. I'm not going to ask anybody to read that. I just wanted people to see what it looks like in the plan. We don't just have the strategy. In this case, strategies 1 and 2 were very similar, so we put them together as one shared action item. What we've done is not only explained what that is, we've provided specific action steps for each one, sort of a checklist, do this 1, 2, 3, 4, to get that process rolling. We identify other partner agencies that might be involved. If necessary, in case this one, it doesn't have a cost, but if there is a cost to it, we've identified that. These two particular ones are a little more staff-based, staff effort time. With that, I will just walk through each one in high-level form. The first two critical path strategies are about working with that UDC, that UDO, making sure standards are in place that allow all those housing options that we talked about in the appropriate zoning districts, and that's a big part of the conversation we're currently having. Looking at density bonuses and parking reduction incentives to encourage micro-unit creation, like I said earlier, trying to get more housing that's affordable but market-based, non-subsidized. That was a really important comment we heard. Ownership, very important. So again, one way to do that is to think about housing as different types of units, and smaller units can reduce the cost, and that's a lot of what these first two critical path strategies are all about, is how do we bake that into the city's ordinances so that the developers can just do it. Amend the city's ordinances for the park land dedication. What this came out of was, we heard a lot of folks say we have enough parks. We ran an analysis, and I would say that's true for half of the city. In particular on the east side, there's a lot of parks. There's a lot of big parks. There's a lot of facilities. I think as growth has spread west, that has slowed down some. So what this critical path strategy is all about is just saying, hey, let's make sure we're looking at that fee and lieu ordinance and making sure we're taking fee and lieu when we need it and where it makes sense, or do we want to look at that and say, hey, there might be a better methodology to say you need to provide some park space because that's what's needed. I want to be clear on this. I'm not suggesting that it has to be park maintained city space. It could be they dedicate it as part of the HOA, as part of the development, and they're required of maintaining it, but we did identify some pockets in town where maybe a little more park coverage would be okay. And so that's where we're trying to get in on narrowing down on exactly what that looks like in the ordinance. Pretty, we thought low risk, high reward type of critical path strategy. We heard a lot about downtown parking and the need for more parking, which there's been a lot of studies and a lot of effort on that, so I won't get into too much, but did want, at least as a first step, to provide a nice parking map for residents and visitors that can be linked to the online GIS systems. Basically say, here's more available street parking and other parking areas that aren't maybe right around the square. Because we do feel that there's some parking available, especially at busy times. We got to work or walk for it a little bit. So we want to make it easier for residents to find that parking. Rental registration. This really came from the idea that we heard a lot of out-of-town companies are buying single-family homes and renting them, which that's a market thing that's going to happen. But there are ways to monitor that and at least make sure that those homes aren't falling into disrepair since the owners are out of state, other items like that. So other communities in the Dayton area, Montgomery County, Miami County have looked at doing this, and some have implemented it, which is a rental registration and inspection program. It basically means when you rent a property, you register it so the city knows where it is, and you can go one step further and actually require regular inspections, usually in between lease periods. So the fire department can go inside the facility with permission and make sure the smoke detectors are in the right place, make sure there's no structural issues, there's no disrepair, plumbing's working, that kind of stuff. Just one way to help make sure that housing stock is maintained. We wanted, this came out, and I know a lot's going on in these areas, but we just want to make sure we keep an eye on continuing to develop the former industrial areas near downtown into more downtown-like uses, especially along the river. There's a lot of redevelopment opportunity here, and we want to make sure that was noted so that we can capitalize on that, work with developers, or if even take it a step further or two if we need to, maybe even the city proactively develop some concept plans and some sort of what we call pattern books to say this is what we want that to look like. So a developer can come in and say, all right, cool, this is what the city wants, this is what they'd like to see. It's just one step, in the process. We've sort of shortened it to make sure and encourage that to happen. We want to improve the understanding of the industry clusters. I talked about this a lot during the economic development piece, but it's really about going out and making sure we know exactly what those industry clusters are, what are their utility needs, their demands, their suppliers. Want to keep supporting them to make sure they're not only existing businesses are happy, but as we grow the economy, as we grow those industry clusters, make sure we know what we're doing, and that's really more of a staff effort of going out there and just getting a really good understanding. My example of this, when I was in the public sector, St. Charles, Illinois, unbeknownst to me and anybody else, was a plastic mold injection powerhouse. I had no idea why. We assumed it was cheap land, we assumed it was workforce. So we went out and started talking to businesses, and it turned out it's because we're our own overhead utility provider. And it's not that our rates were much better than anybody else's. We bought them off the grid like anybody else's. Our reliability factor was like triple what of theirs ComEd could supply. And these folks they're a volume business. Everything they do is how many parts per second they can pump out, because that's how quick they move. And if they're offline for even 20 minutes, they're not profitable for a day. And so we found out that our biggest asset was our great electric division. And so that's the kind of thing you can go out and talk to these businesses here, like we talked about fabrication and food manufacturing that are close here. Hey, what are those things that make you really happy about Troy, and how can we use that to sell to your suppliers and other businesses like you? So it's you almost have to become an industry expert, even though you're a staff person, to be able to go that, and then you go to the right conventions and other places to talk to those people, but that's really what this goal is all about. We want to make sure we're continuing to conserve downtown, redevelop downtown. This goal is specific, and we noted this, and it was confirmed through all of our conversations how great a job everybody's done that's involved, getting the first floor of downtown businesses occupied. A lot of restaurants, a lot of shops, a lot of great things happening, but maybe that hasn't quite carried over to the upper stories yet. So what this critical path strategy is all about is, hey, how can we do some things to incent maybe a conversion of those to apartments, for instance, or office space. Things to not only occupy those second stories or third stories in some cases of buildings, but also, hey, how can we maybe solve some of that housing demand that we were talking about earlier too. So we put an example of here, and the program I helped write actually when I was in the public sector, just provide some 50-50 matching grants for necessary improvements. Funding mechanism can go a lot of ways on that. That's a step that would have to be figured out later. But the one caution I would say is make sure the program's written to only pay for permanent improvements. So fire sprinklers, installation, fire upgrades, electric, plumbing, things that a building owner couldn't take with them when they leave. That we want to make sure this is a permanent upgrade of the building, not just the business or the apartment. Another couple of strategies that sort of tie that together. One is to develop a 5-year park and rec master plan. In Ohio, it's not required like it is in other states to do this, but if you do one and you start thinking about your goals and how they relate to the state does their own version of this called the SCORP, it helps you apply for what's called Land Water Conservation Fund grants, and it gives you points in your application so that if it aligns for that, it comes back. If you have this plan in place, it just helps you apply for funding and do that. And I think it's always good to benchmark where you're at. Another thing we've been seeing in the last few years in terms of park usage, that it's kind of a byproduct of what happened after the lockdowns and COVID, but people just go out to parks more and do more passive things, walking trails, sitting down, having lunch, kind of being in an area by themselves. I think parks for a long time were focused solely on like ball fields and those kinds of and playgrounds. Still need those, still want those, but also what we're starting to see is more of a demand for those other types of activities. So when you start, your plan aligns with the state's plan, you can go out and get funding for that. I believe last time I checked, they just raised it in Ohio. I think it's a matching grant of $700,000 or thereabouts. So you can, if you have a 50-50 match, it's a $1.4 million project that they'll pay half of. So it's a good thing to have that just in case you're lined up to go out and get those. And then implement some park improvements that require less maintenance. That's something we heard from staff in that there's a lot out there to maintain. Staffs are getting stretched thin. Let's think of some things that can be done, such as meditation gardens and walking paths that don't maybe require as much active maintenance or as regular maintenance. Things that don't need to be painted as frequently, that kind of stuff. And then we did focus, since we heard so much about downtown, we had a whole section and a couple of critical path strategies devoted to that. I wanted to highlight this in the sense that there's been a lot of effort and thought and studies done in downtown, especially for what I'd call more long-term goals, such as bridges across the river for pedestrians and big, streetscape improvements. So those were all great, and they're pretty recent, and it's not our style to like come up with a whole new set of goals that are counterproductive to those, or even if they're the same. So what we did is focus on intermediate goals, things that are a little more near-term, a little more low cost, but a high reward, such as using leftover spaces, the wide sidewalks around the square, for instance, or potentially some parking spots to do what we call parklets, provide little areas for outdoor dining and/or activities for kids. The image on the bottom is a neat new thing we're starting to see pop up where you can rent or buy a projector that, it projects an image onto the outside street, but they're interactive. The ones I've seen are koi ponds where like the kids step on it and the fish actually react and move and the bubbles come up and, these are things you can just project, and you don't have to do it all the time. You don't have to do it during busy times, especially the parklet idea. These are intended and designed to be moved when you need them out of the way, when you want that parking back. So really just trying to use your existing assets and, talked about the entertainment district near the beginning of the presentation. This is one more step towards that, for providing more activities in downtown and around the square, but in this case, doing it in a way that's not exactly permanent. It's nice to have some variety and have things new. I know whenever you build something new, it has kind of a bump in activity, and then people get used to it. This is one way to keep things fresh, too, so. And this last one, we did a lot of high-level utility analysis, all the growth that was projected in that future land use map. It does come with some infrastructure upgrades, so the next step along that line would be to model that system completely, both water and wastewater, so you can look for those pinch points where you might need to start thinking about capacity upgrades. I know right now the city has plenty, but if things do grow out the way we've shown our 20-year map, what does that mean? What does that look like? So there's folks that can come in and really analyze that in much more detail and look at your whole system and really help you plan that out for the next 10 years. And then our last one is, this gets back to the parking issue. I know there's been a lot of thoughts about parking decks, building other facilities, and those are great, and this doesn't discount that, but we wanted to see some maybe other ways to get people around. And an idea we came up with, and I have to thank the mayor for part of this idea because it was her suggestion at first. She told me about a system like this in San Diego that I wasn't aware of, where you could have little mini transit electric golf carts that drop people off. It's almost like a longer valet service. So you could have set destinations. We put some thought into what a conceptual plan could look like, a route. But the big idea for us was really, you have a lot of parking facilities right across the river, especially if there's nothing going on in those facilities that particular night. Let's get people to use those and just make it easier for them to get across the river, was the whole idea here. And so it's another way to help maybe alleviate the parking concern without having to take the permanent step yet of building a parking deck while those kind of long-term things are still being considered. So that was really a big thought process here. With that, I'll pause and...
Before you leave
Yep.
the new standards, as I remember, you had a section that referred to flexible zoning standards. That scares me. Could you explain that?
So by flexible, what we mean is that it has enough flexibility baked into the ordinance itself, which we haven't worked all that out yet. We haven't finished writing the UDC. What we're just doing is recommending that, like for instance, the micro units and reducing parking requirements to encourage those, that there's enough flexibility built into the ordinance so that someone, whether it be staff, the plan commission, or a developer can just read it and say, all right, I understand what the goals and objectives are here and I can implement it because it's very clear and it's put in there, as opposed to, you're a unit, thou shalt have 2 parking spaces for every unit. We can say, well, if you're doing a micro unit, maybe you only have to do 1 parking space per unit because it's meeting this other goal. So when we say flexible, it's not like we get to rewrite the code whenever we want. It's more, there's just a few options that are already outlined in the plan that you can use for providing something that the city wants. Is that kind of what you were thinking?
Well, my reaction was I would not want to have flexible zoning standards in my neighborhood.
Sure. And I think the example I used was a pretty specific one probably for downtown. And so that's part of the thought process we're going to go through as we're really digging into the standards now. We're still vetting those. These were more the high-level concepts of what do we think we can do to help those standards become flexible. In this case, it's really, we're talking about parking flexibility or just flexible. The way we use it is more just making sure the codes have some leeway in there for good ideas. But it's still concrete enough that it's enforceable, and that's definitely a big part of what we're going to do.
Before any details are worked out, it will go to the planning commission.
Oh, yeah. Yes, sir. And our advisory group for the plan will be our advisory group for that process as well, and we'll be vetting that out the next 6 months or so. We've already started drafting the standards, but they haven't been vetted yet, and so we want to put something on paper for people to react to get those kind of reactions. But yeah, and that'll have to go through its own approval process at the end of that too. but maybe I'll go I don't have a lot on the code this evening, since, like I mentioned, we're still very much in development of that. I guess this is probably a good pausing point for the plan itself, and see if there's any comments, questions, thoughts.
If I may.
Yeah.
Larry, off of your, what were you getting at? And I'm hearing from him that it's primarily about vehicles and that sort of thing, but I'm assuming that you're talking building itself.
It could be building, it could be almost anything, you know. To have a flexible zoning standard, and let's say your neighborhood, and you're perfectly happy with single-family residential, and then, for whatever reason, well, this is flexible, that doesn't really mean single-family residential, we can put a couple businesses here, maybe a light industry, that's extreme, but that's the sort of thing that troubles me.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and I completely understand that concern, and so every zoning district, just like it is now, will be tied to one of those colors on the map and then on the zoning map. And neighborhoods like the one you're describing, that zoning district will probably be pretty narrow for single-family homes, and those aren't going away. They're still outlined here in the character classes, and then we call it single-unit detached here. In the current draft, there's actually 3 more versions of that are more specific, even than what we put in the plan. And they're the only places where we'll be allowing flexibility, like I mentioned earlier, where it makes sense, like downtown or in a mixed-use zoning district. There are a couple of character classes along major roads that do allow some residential office-type flexibility, but that's already actually happening along, say, Main Street and Market Street, where we're just going to make sure that those businesses are accounted for so that we don't make them non-conforming, if that makes sense.
I guess as long as I've interrupted you. You're very strong on dealing with housing, infrastructure, amenities. I thought maybe a little light on economic development. I see the Troy Development Council is represented. I wanted to get your reaction to what's been presented.
Hello, Joseph Graves, Troy Development Council CEO. We have been involved in this process. You said around 2,500 acres of future industrial growth.
On that map, yeah.
I think that's ample acreage. But when economic development, it's not just seeing a flat piece of property. It's looking at the infrastructure, water, sewer, looking at what electric is at that site now and in the future. Because, industries take a lot of electricity. It could be natural gas. You have to look at everything. So 2,500 acres for the next 20 years, I would think would be ample. I'm comfortable with that.
So you're happy with the plan?
I'm sure there could be tweaks, but I'm happy with the acreage for future industrial development. Thank you.
I have a question, maybe more for Ms. Snyder or Mr. Titterton. The comprehensive plan that's online is 180 pages.
Not to that podium, please.
Pat Seaver, council member. I'm just trying to follow along with the comprehensive plan that's online, which is 108 pages. You've obviously synthesized a lot of this.
Yes.
Is this going to go online after today?
This,
PowerPoint? This slide, the PowerPoint
Yes.
presentation?
Yes, it will be online.
Because it's very difficult to follow along with the comprehensive plan and stay consistent with that. There's a lot of narrative, the way you combine slides, like the land use slide, you have narrative off to the left that's not there. So it makes it difficult to basically digest all that at the same time. So these will go online?
This will be online tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions before? We only have a few slides left, so if anybody has anything on the plan now, would be perfect time. All right, well, moving on, I just wanted to do this more as an update. We are, from this point in the process, the plan's going through the adoption. It's a little bit ahead of the code, and that was on purpose. We want to get through the planning, the land use mapping, all the things we just talked about before we started writing the code to make sure we weren't getting ahead of ourselves. Now that we're at that point, we're gonna be drafting, you're gonna be seeing a lot more drafts of the chapters coming through. We're gonna ensure that the code is both user-friendly for staff and the public. We're revising existing regulations, looking at all the things that came out of the comp plan, and we'll be going through that edit regulation process in the next, say, 3 to 4 months. And then so that's where we are now. We're drafting. There'll be full reviews, presentations to the Plan Commission. We'll keep working with our advisory group as we do the drafting. So a lot more to come on that effort, a lot more to think through, a lot more to process, a lot more standards to iron out. We're looking, here we are in October. We're kind of finishing up the plan process, and then as we look at the code, we're actually going to be meeting with the advisory group next Wednesday, a week from now, start working through all those drafts and start looking to have pretty much the whole draft done by the end of the year and start talking about public facing documents early 2025. And that's all the formal presentation I have for this evening.
Well, this will be coming to the Planning Commission, and I'll let you know I am very concerned about your proposals to increase the density of residential.
Okay.
So
Sure.
that'll come up here in our meeting.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and we're happy. I've said this through the whole process, and I mean it. This is Troy's plan. It's not our plan. We provide our thoughts and what we think, but whatever we need to put in the plan to make it that it works for you, that's what we're going to do.
Are there any other comments or questions? Want to open it up to council? Yes, sir, Mr. Schilling.
Mr. Schilling. Go ahead, Jeff.
Mr. Baird?
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I noticed in your presentation there was a lot of emphasis on trails and trying to tie the various areas together and develop the trail system. And I know we've had some recent discussion requiring subdivisions to have their borders, instead of sidewalks, have trails.
Okay, yeah.
And also establishing trails, one trail example to link, the West End. We talk about the West End doesn't have any parks. We also don't have any way of getting, the West End doesn't have any way of, essentially, other than getting in the vehicles to safely get into the downtown area. And so we've made some proposals on establishing a trail system along West Main Street, replacing the sidewalk on the north side, and essentially developing a trail system that would link the whole West End into the Great Miami River Trail system.
Yes, sir.
And so, what's your thoughts on that?
I mentioned it on this slide. I think, yeah, more trails on Main Street would be great. We looked at that very early on. Since there were some recent reconstruction projects there, we didn't necessarily talk about trails in certain sections because that was just invested in. When we start talking about, we did look at it on Main Street. You said north?
We're looking at, what was proposed was a trail that would run along the north side of West Main Street from Washington Road to the interstate.
Okay. Yeah, that's on our plan. That was one of the priorities.
That's one of it's in the complete street. It's hard to tell that map. I mean, it's.
Yeah, that's basically this line over here. So here's I-75, and it's coming through this way. I mean,
okay.
We probably looked at the south side a little heavier, in all honesty, on Main Street, because that's where the current pedestrian connection over 75 is. And so widening that might be easier than the north side is when we looked at it. But I think the overall theme is all of this was how do we get people downtown and how do we get them over 75. We talked about that a lot. We focused on McKeag as maybe the first notch in that connectivity.
Well, the problem with McKeag is it's not in the city.
It's not currently. Well, we were talking about
that's going to be a long development process on that.
It would be. We were focusing more probably east of 75 in that conversation. So get over the interstate and then get people downtown. It looked like a really good opportunity just based on how that's a really good east-west connector or spine, if you will, for all the north-south to get to. That's why we focused on that one. But I think adding some connectivity along Main Street was also part of this, and we considered that too.
And connecting the subdivisions, trying to connect the subdivisions together with trails is.
Yeah, I think that.
Are other communities doing that?
So that's something you see probably more in the next phase, as the subdivision standards will require, usually along the frontages, you put in certain requirements for that.
Yeah.
In all honesty, it's a mixed bag. Industrial areas, not as much as commercial, and certainly residential areas, that's a requirement. It's becoming more and more popular. When you start getting really far out of community, where, like in these big industrial parks where it's spread out, you kind of see people picking and choosing priority routes as opposed to every subdivision having one, if that makes sense. Like, the best example I can think of locally to Indianapolis is Plainfield, where they've done a big push to have trails all through the community. What they do in the industrial parks is pick the big roads, the major classifications, and they'll put a bike trail in, but they'll basically, to help save some time and cost, they put it on one side of the right of way, and then build connections, stuff like that.
Have you been to Fishers?
Oh, yeah, I live 10 minutes from Fishers, our office is right next to it.
So they have quite a few trails there.
Oh, yeah, they do.
Yeah. All right.
They're doing the same thing. They actually just redid their trail plan to specifically identify a series of what I'll call spines, as opposed to making sure they're everywhere, because they grew so fast and so quick, they couldn't do them all at once, and now they're kind of having a retrofit.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, yes, sir.
When you did this map,
Yes.
did you start from ground zero, or do you have
So,
something to start with?
yeah, the city already had kind of a policy in place of it was called like share the road concepts, and some existing trails and proposed trails. That was our base, and then we started and expanded from
Okay.
there.
My question generated, because my understanding is the prior administration had a biking group, for lack of better terms, and they did map out a lot of roads all over the city to get you back and forth.
Okay.
Did you have access to that?
I did not. That was new to me. I don't recall seeing that if we did.
Well, Mr. Rozell, that served as the basis of the complete streets map that's online.
Okay.
Okay.
So that was part of that.
I
baseline.
apologize. I didn't know it by that name, but that is the base mapping we went with.
Any other comments or questions?
Again, I should be up there. I just was gonna say the most impressive thing I've seen out of this, from being on council for a number of years, both in the nineties and now, is the engagement. And one of the things that I think sometimes gets overlooked is the citizen input. And when you were at the Tour de Donut, I believe, or maybe Strawberry Festival, collecting data, I think that was impressive to a lot of people. And look, we're not experts, we can't figure out this, that's where we're gonna listen to you and then make determinations that our residents think makes the most decision. But to look at that public engagement, I think that's something that I haven't seen us do in a long time, and I would like to thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's one of the hallmarks of the practices we built it, is we've developed this philosophy, we go where the people are. I mean, open houses are great, and especially in Troy, people came out to them, but we don't always get that. So that's why we started doing all these things. In fact, you'd be surprised, a pretty familiar face is lurking under that strawberry suit, as a matter of fact, so.
That's where you get your dance from, right?
Yeah. There may be video of the person in that strawberry suit who may or may not be at the podium, dancing in that.
Okay, any other questions or comments from council or?
Well, just one comment. When we began, I was concerned about a lot of these plans come back as very esoteric, or, as I put it, gibberish.
Yep, I remember that.
You did this in plain English.
Yes, sir.
And I appreciate that.
Thank you. We try to, that's another hallmark of what we try to do, is make sure it's usable. That's the whole point. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to address, there's been some comments about the change of focus from an industrial to more of a retail entertainment area. And I think what we're doing here is looking at the downtown area, that is becoming our entertainment area. But from what you've shown us tonight, I think that there's a lot of room for industrial growth. We're going to essentially do two different things. In other words, to continue to improve the downtown, make it more attractive to people to come in and shop and eat and be entertained, And on the other hand, though, we've outlined, a lot of areas that, can be developed for industrial use, manufacturing, this type of thing, where Troy has always been strong on, and I think that a lot of residents want us to continue that practice, and I think you've identified that well.
Yes, sir, thank you. And I think, I didn't mention this earlier in the presentation, but it's always important to, and we heard this through this process, time and time again, is downtown is an economic development driver. People want to come here because of the entertainment and the dining. And when they're showing sites off to foreign investors or local investors, they bring them downtown because that it's a showcase piece. And quality of life has become a very big part of economic development. And so Troy has that in spades. That's why we really kind of, to your point, we focused on that, but also is all these things, the housing, the economic development, they all weave together, and that was a big part of it. But thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments?
I do have one more question. When it
Go
comes
ahead.
to housing, what is the price point that we're looking at for attainable housing?
Yep, so what the market is telling us is the kind of those last two bullet points. When we say attainable, we've switched from affordable to attainable for the very purposes. Attainable has a certain nomenclature associated with it. All we're trying to say is housing that's attainable for the folks that work here, that live here, that want to live here. It's not, there's like no set X amount of money or less equals attainable. It's what can people afford based on their salaries. And so in the existing conditions report, that's where those numbers come from, the $1,250 to $2,500 a month. It's based on average salaries and of not only residents, but the jobs in the area too.
All right, and then $200,000 for purchasing price range?
Yes.
A lot of developers believe that it's hard to make a profit at $200,000.
Yeah.
What changes need to be initiated in order to make it where that is profitable and we can have housing that's built at that price?
Yeah, the thought there is that when we say purchase, we don't just mean single-family homes. It could be a condo, it could be a duplex, a townhome, other types of, it could be a single-family home. I think what we're trying to do is, and that's what we were talking about earlier about the zoning code and how it relates to housing, is making sure enough options are provided in the right zoning districts so that you can hit that price point. It might not look like a single-family home, but it is a home that you can purchase, like a condo above one of the downtown buildings, so to speak. So that we're trying to come up with ways to reduce the square footage so that it is market-driven, but it might not look like a single-family house at the end of the day. That's kind of where those price points come into play. Now we got to think through all that in the zoning code.
Thank you.
Yep.
So in other words, there will be in the zoning code for things like quad homes where you have, or what you used to call patio homes.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking to one of our developers, he said, yeah, if we could build, quad homes, we could get it into that price range. But the single-family home with a little piece of land around it, $200,000, they can't do it. He said they're just with the all the requirements and the fees required and everything. He said and of course the land acquisition costs. He said there's just no way to do it. But if we do as you say, either multi-level condos or where you have a lot of shared walls in much smaller lots. Those types of things might be affordable into that $200,000 range.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going for there.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, but we're still working through what districts it makes sense to have those. But as we keep talking through that's been one of the big focus points is where those types of units make sense and in what zoning districts. Absolutely.
No.
You want me to come?
Yeah, because they can't get you on camera.
I'm sorry, it's being videoed. As RITs become more popular in, like you said, corporations are buying, have you seen in your planning anything that we can do to eliminate that or slow that? I mean, obviously people can buy whatever they want, but is there anything that you have seen? Because I do think that we do have a lot of out-of-state corporate landlords that are coming in. And as we look to gentrify, because we're going to need affordable housing, so as we look to gentrify different areas of Troy, one of the things that we'd want to do is make sure that the people who are buying those houses either are going to live in those houses or at least be readily ascertainable to make sure that they're, maintained.
Yeah, I think there's no straightforward answer to that, unfortunately. I think from the city's perspective, legally speaking, it is a unit to be lived in or have a business in, or that's what zoning controls. When you start getting into ownership versus rental, it gets tricky. The only way I've seen that successfully controlled is like through covenants and conditions and restrictions through HOAs. I guess you could ask a developer to require that as one of those, but that's another tricky thing, and then how do you enforce it becomes another issue. So that's a real sticky wicket. That's why when we heard about that, that's why we thought of the rental inspection program. It's more about what can the city do to make sure that those homes are maintained in quality, whether you rent or purchase. It's legally very difficult to go down that road. And it's become harder as more and more court decisions have come out the last, say, 15 years on that topic. So I don't know of anything readily available that the city can do to say, no, you're not allowed to rent that, per se, unless it's with the developer. And it's really more on them and the CCRs they sign when they buy it, unfortunately.
I think it's a bit easier to identify $2,500 acres of industrial property for future growth, but it's having landowners who are willing to sell that property is another thing. And we've talked very much about solar farm options. It's prohibiting some of our growth as well. So that's another component of this as well. So we identified 2,500 acres, but we may only have 200 acres that want to sell. So just remember that.
As an example, I remember when F&P went in and they wanted to buy a buffer, and the adjoining property owner, I approached him, I said, how much do you want for it? And he says, there isn't enough money. So you're right.
Yeah. Just keep that in mind.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, great point. You have to have willing land, or sellers, I should say.
Okay, if there are any other comments, I'd like to thank Matt for your presentation and stand by for answering any questions that we may get from the public.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll open this up to a public hearing for the attendees of tonight's meeting. I'd like to just limit yourself to 3 minutes, and if there are if you do stray off the topic of tonight on comprehensive plans, we most likely will step in to get you back on track. We're not talking about the zoning at this point in time, or the subdivision regulations. We're just strictly on the text of the comprehensive plan. When you do come up, please approach the podium and give us your full name and address for the record, and we'll open it up to anyone that's interested.
Good evening, Ben Southerly, Troy Historic Preservation Alliance, 110.5 West Main Street. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. I appreciate the statement in the draft comprehensive plan that all of Troy's success in part flows from downtown. Could not agree more. On page 143, it goes on to talk about how downtown has become a magnet for festivals and other entertainment events and has a great food culture. I would add the historic built environment makes all that possible. Few people are interested in enjoying a charcuterie board in a strip mall. Our historic streetscapes and beautiful public square create an amazing backdrop and environment for experiences of all kinds. Our downtown, like many others across Ohio, is enjoying a resurgence, and it's a tremendous success story, a success that's largely a result of generally good stewardship by previous generations of property owners. I'd like to share some thoughts this evening on how we can build on that success. If I had to sum it up, it would involve shifting our decision-making culture in the downtown from why we can't to what if. First, I'd like to mention specifically critical path strategy number 8 on page 173. Creating funding opportunities that assist with the conversion of upper story building space into apartments, offices, or condos is a wonderful idea, The city is to be commended for identifying this as a priority. The city identifies as partners staff, the Troy Development Council, Troy Main Street, Troy Community Works, the Ohio Department of Development, and specifically the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit Program, Miami County Health Department, and Miami County Building Regulations. We would also ask to be part of this initiative. THPA could bring a skill set that would complement those of other partners listed on this project. As part of our revitalization work on the IOF building and old courthouse on West Main Street, we're placing a conservation easement on the building. While the idea of a conservation easement is not new, it will be new to Troy. Easements such as these, when donated by property owners, are proven tools for helping to make financing packages work on repairing these old buildings. We can bring some valuable experiences and potentially even grant writing resources to bear. So we'd just put that request in. We'd also like to put a plug in for an approach not mentioned in the comprehensive plan, and that is a commercial and industrial vacant property registry. Having just taken point on a $1 million stabilization and repair project for a building on West Main Street, THPA can tell you that such a registry would make a big difference in our community, and it could be a great deterrent against disinvestment. Instead of why we can't, what if? The 2005 comprehensive plan called for ad hoc historical representation on the Troy Planning Commission. That never happened. In fact, feedback from the historical community or any other member of the public is generally not permitted at these meetings unless you are the applicant. In the 2025 plan, you will not see any mention of engaging owners of historic buildings or people with skill sets in areas such as historic preservation and downtown decision making. That's an unfortunate oversight. The lack of downtown stakeholder representation on the Troy Planning Commission holds our city back from accomplishing even greater things. This is by no means a criticism of folks who currently serve on the Planning Commission. We understand these are dedicated public servants. But if we waited to have this conversation until nobody was sitting on the Planning Commission, it would never happen. And in fact, the conversation is long overdue. When we look at planning commissions or other bodies responsible for making downtown-related decisions in other Ohio towns, we see communities that value placing folks on their planning commissions who live downtown, own property or businesses downtown, or work downtown. We see communities intentionally seeking out professional staff, professionals such as architects, attorneys, and historic preservation folks to serve on their planning commissions. I've been told that the city doesn't need to have professionals like this on the Planning Commission and that they can be sought out from time to time as their services are needed. I would just point out that that never happened at the IOF building.
I have to call your time on this, Ben. Will you be able to provide that document?
Yeah.
Copies of
In the
that?
future, could we get a heads up if we're not on how much time we're going to be given for our comments? 3 minutes isn't very much for a 180-page document.
No, but I just want to make sure, you know, that we're kind of deviating a little bit off the subject at hand, is, you know, the comprehensive plan. You know, I recognize what you're saying, but, you know, just limit the conversation to the comprehensive plan in itself, and that's the text.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we'll be glad to distribute whatever he wants to leave with us.
Will you be able to leave that with us?
I'll email you.
Thank you.
Great.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Carter. I live at 17 East Water Street. I want to start off with saying something positive. I like a lot of the things that are coming Troy's direction, so I am excited about that. Living and working downtown. Like I mentioned, I live at 17 East Water Street, and we moved here in 2006. And our property has always been a residential home. It was built approximately 1885, and it's currently located in the Central Business District. I'm not going to get too deep into the current zoning stuff, but I feel like this is the appropriate time to bring it up. So currently the zoning restrictions only allow for residential use on the second floor or above. Essentially, I'm not supposed to be living on the first floor of my house. And my house was obviously there far before this zoning was put into place, the current zoning, and I believe it was all the way back to like the 70s, since it's really been appropriately classified. But, the zoning has caused issues in the past for my family and I, with appraisals and accessing, equity that we've built up in our house, because naturally, getting a residential loan for a property that's zoned business has raised a lot of flags with people, in the banking institution. A few years ago, my husband and I came in front of the Planning Commission and requested that our property zoning be edited to OR1 to reflect us using the first floor for residential use. We were denied because we were told the board didn't want to do spot zoning. And the thing is, there's another single-family home on my block, and I have to assume that we're not the only two families that are located in the central business district with a single-family house. And so, since the council and commission are in the midst of making heavy edits to planning and zoning in Troy, I think it's the perfect time to reflect how single-family homes located in a single business district are classified. Current labeling creates unnecessary red tape for those of us that own homes downtown. During the presentation, it was highlighted how important housing is in the Troy area, and I ask that you consider all current resident needs and those that are falling into the gaps with existing plans. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Matt, did you write that down? That would be a UDC.
Yeah, those are some of the use standards we're still very much flushing out as part of the districts. What we've done is just provide general descriptions in this document of what those districts could have. Now we're in the process of figuring out what the zoning code will permit and not permit.
And the UDC is basically that zoning code that will go to the council ultimately, so that's something that
Right.
what she's saying can be addressed at that point.
Yeah, I was making sure I got that in my notes. That we'll look at that as part of that overall district structure.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Bradley Baring on 105 Crestwood. And while I live outside of the Troy city limits, I live in an area that is rapidly becoming an area of growth, particularly on the north side of town. I am predicting that within the next 10 to 20 years, Troy will probably grow out to, if not close to, my area of residence. And first of all, I want to say thank the Planning Commission for undertaking this arduous task. A 180-page program plan in 1 year is pretty darn good, so thank you for that. Just a couple things I want to hit on. Number one is the transportation portion of the program. I saw in the plan, which I read today, that the mention about the Miami County Transit program. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had some notes on what the current status of that is and what they're thinking about doing, and some thoughts on how that, maybe some collaboration could be there.
Thank you. I think collaboration, it's about time we collaborated to fix our public transit system. It only runs during the day, it doesn't run at night. What I would like to see us possibly explore is a regional transit authority, something like what Montgomery County does, to bridge the gap, to bring people into Troy, since we have people obviously living outside of Troy that come to Troy to work. We need to make it easier for them to get here. And I think a regional transit authority would be a thing to do. Possibly down the road, I don't know. Secondly is the downtown. I remember downtown, what I call Downtown 1 back in the 80s, was very booming, very popular. You had a lot of businesses downtown. And then a little thing called the West Troy boom happened. I'm sure you all remember that. But now Troy downtown is experiencing another resurgence. But however, I don't see parklets happening in our downtown quadrants, and I'll tell you why. They are never empty. The parking quadrants are never empty. They're always full. I have a hard time finding a parking space downtown in those quadrants to save my life. I think a parking structure is needed. So I would encourage you to take a look at possibly building one. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there any other comments from the public? Seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Is there any closing comments that you want to add, Austin? Or, okay. Thank you very much then for,
Mr. Chair, just to kind of wrap it up, the next step in the process would be that the Planning Commission will consider what happened today. We've got a meeting, next Wednesday at 3:30? To consider whether the comprehensive plan portion, we would adopt that, but then again, the UDC, the subdivision regs, that is still a work in progress. You said February, tentatively?
Yeah, tentatively when we'd be back for more
I
of
usually
the
say-
adoption proceedings, but
I
we'll
usually say weather permitting, but
weather permitting, yeah,
that's
for
my
sure.
thing.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's what we're looking at right now.
All right, and so that part of it definitely will come to the council.
Will there be a public hearing at that meeting for anyone who wasn't able to attend tonight or watched online tonight or saw new documents?
No, we will have the slides online, the video will be posted as well. So there'll be opportunities to watch this and to go through the slide deck, tomorrow morning.
But no public hearing at the planning commission?
We don't do a public hearing at the planning commission, that's why we were doing it tonight. Yeah. But if anybody had any feedback, they can always email to, Mrs. Knight prior to that, and she'll send it out to the planning commission.
okay, any other comments or questions? Thank you all for attending, and we'll close the, commission meeting for tonight then.